the core of the conflict remains the denial and rejection that the Jewish people have any right, any business being in this land. And UNRWA is the organization that carries this story. I'm sure you've heard of the movement Justice for Palestine. It's very popular on American campuses. And especially if you're a young person who wants to do good, of course you will join Justice for Palestine. I want justice for Palestine. Until you realize that the injustice that needs to be corrected so that there will be justice for Palestine is the very existence of the State of Israel. Only when that injustice is made to go away can there be justice for Palestine. And then you realize that justice for Palestine is actually a very violent idea. It's about erasing the so-called injustice of the existence of the State of Israel. Every Arab who lived in the land, by now called an Arab Palestinian, and their descendants in perpetuity are a refugee from Palestine. This is how we started from 700,000 displaced people, and today we have 5 million people who are officially registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine. In addition, you have 2 to 3 million more people who, even though they might be citizens of Denmark, continue to argue that they are refugees from Palestine. And the Palestine they say they are refugees from is not the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestine they say they are refugees from is the West Bank, Gaza, and the State of Israel. So superseding the entire area. This is how you can have the amazing absurdity of 2 million of those who are registered as refugees who live in the West Bank and Gaza. So thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you, Dina, for making all of this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to come to Denmark, so I'm happy to finally have an opportunity to be here with you. I will go directly into the issue, but it's merely one way to discuss the big issue. And the question is, what are we fighting over? What is this conflict really about? Because my decision to get involved with UNRWA came precisely from the sense that when the world talks about the conflict, they don't talk about it correctly. They don't see it as it should be seen. Maybe they don't want to see as it should be seen. And what we in Israel understand, somehow it seems that the world often doesn't want to understand. So when we ask the question, what are we fighting over? If you ask many people around the world, what is this conflict about? What are we fighting over? They will tell you the settlements, the occupation. This is the problem. Please come in. The reason we don't have peace is the settlements. The reason we don't have peace is the occupation. This is what the world will tell you. End these things and you will have peace. Recognize a Palestinian state and you will have peace. I was told that the campaign now in the city, what's the name of the city? Okay. Is basically says, boycott the settlements, recognize Palestine. This is the core of what the world believes is necessary for peace. Make clear that the settlements are wrong, recognize a Palestinian state, and we're good to go, and we're going to have peace. This is what I used to think as well. I came from labor Zionism, the Israeli Labor Party. Grew up in Israel in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, a firm believer that the day that the Palestinians will have a state in the West Bank and Gaza, the day they will even have a chance to have that state is the day we have peace. And for me, and for people like me, the last 15 years have been years of increasing questioning and skepticism towards this basic premise, from a variety of directions. The first came especially at the end of the 90s, in the year 2000, when it really seemed as if peace was at hand. It's all over. We're done. We finally have it. And Ehud Barak goes to Camp David, goes further than anyone has ever gone before, about as far as one can go. And yet, and even continues in Taba later. And all of that, the Palestinians have a chance, a real chance, to have a state. It's not perfect. It's not everything. But they can finally have the dignity that comes from having a state, the freedom. And yet the word yes is nowhere to be found. And this happens again in 2008. And even, it seems that this happened again in 2014. So with the opportunity to have a state, no yes. I lived through the violence of the Second Intifada, the buses blowing up in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Beersheba, not controversial areas. And I remember thinking at that time, I wanted to find a Palestinian, hold him by the shoulders and say, what do you want? Tell me what you want. Because if you want a state for yourself, I'll fight with you, shoulder to shoulder. But if more than you want a state for yourself, you can't accept that next to that state, me, my people, will have our own state, then I will fight you. If you're telling me that I have to choose between you and me, then I choose me, and I have no problems with that. And later I was brought into meetings with what were called moderate Palestinians, and they would tell me things like, you have no business being here, the Jewish people are not a people, you have no connection to the land, this whole story is made up in order to steal our land. And I remember thinking, if these are the moderates, then this conflict is far deeper and about far bigger issues than what I was led to believe, that it's about boycotting the settlements, ending the settlements, and recognizing Palestine, having a Palestinian state. I realized that fundamentally, there is still no willingness to recognize my right, the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own. I was considered a moderate in Israeli politics because I recognized their right. That's why I support two states. I recognize that there are two peoples on the land. Both have a connection to it. Both have been born and shaped in it. And I'm not saying that our right is superior or exclusive, but neither is theirs. And if we are to have peace ever, we need to recognize that both peoples have a right. Neither is a foreigner, neither is a crusader, colonialist, or interloper. And this has really led me to understand that it is about much deeper issues. And amazingly, during this process, someone sent me a speech by no other than Ernest Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. As I'm sure you know your history, he was no friend to the Jewish people and no friend to the Zionist movement. And yet Ernest Bevin goes to the British Parliament in February of 1947, ahead of the United Nations partition resolution, to explain to the people of Britain why Britain is giving back the mandate that it received from the League of Nations, and why is it essentially reneging on the terms of the mandate and giving it back to the heir of the League of Nations, to the United Nations. And he says the following. He says, His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that there's an irreconcilable conflict on the land. Irreconcilable conflict. Why? He goes on to explain. For the Jews in the land, the essential point of principle is the establishment of a sovereign state. So the Jewish people want their state. Of course, they want it as large as they can get. They were promised the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean in return for their giving up on what became TransJordan as part of the mandate. But fundamentally, they want a state. Then he goes on to say, the Arabs, the essential point of principle for the Arabs in the land is to prevent to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. Now, it's a fascinating analysis of the conflict from February 1947. He says the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. He doesn't say, look, the Jews want the Negev and another 50% of the north, and the Arabs want this part, and we don't know how to draw the borders. He says, fundamentally, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. And if you think about it, it's been the best predictor of behavior of the sides ever since. When faced with the option of having a state, the Jews said yes. They were not happy. They got half of what they thought was their due and just, but they said yes, because fundamentally Bevin was right. They wanted a sovereign state. The Arabs, from their perspective, said, the Jews have no business being here. One half is one half too much. Already in the Peel Commission, 10% was 10% too much. So no. And to this date, when the Palestinians were faced with the options of having a state, the reason they have not said yes is that the price of that state has always been to accept for good and forever and for all times the permanence of the Jewish state. And at least to date, this has been too high a price. And I always hated when there's this view of the Palestinians as some mindless victims. No, they are a people who have made choices that are based on their own sense of what is right and what is just. I'm sure you've heard of the movement Justice for Palestine. It's very popular on American campuses. And especially if you're a young person who wants to do good, of course you will join Justice for Palestine. I want justice for Palestine. Until you realize that the injustice that needs to be corrected so that there will be justice for Palestine is the very existence of the State of Israel. Only when that injustice is made to go away can there be justice for Palestine. And then you realize that justice for Palestine is actually a very violent idea. It's about erasing the so-called injustice of the existence of the State of Israel. This is still the story. I'm not saying it will remain forever, but we need to recognize it for what it is. We need to recognize how deep the conflict goes. And by the way, I'm not making anyone here into some evil. I get the Arab perspective. From my view, obviously, the story of Zionism, the story of the return of the Jewish people to reclaim their homeland after 2,000 years, is one of the most inspiring stories of humankind. But I also recognize that there's a fine line between inspiring and insane. And I can understand that from the Arab perspective, they're like, who comes home after 2,000 years? Who does something like that? Sorry, I had 2 talks already this morning. I get that perspective. It's a crazy story. It's an inspirational story. It's a beautiful story. It's a crazy story. I can understand that the Arabs are somewhat less than inspired and excited by the return of the Jewish people to reclaim their homeland. One day maybe we will bring the stories together, but it will take time. And I do understand that perspective, and as a result, I respect why the conflict is so deep and serious. But my problem is, whereas we and the Palestinians seem to understand each other very well. You know, all these organizations, especially European foundations that bring Israelis and Palestinians to meet, They think that if we only meet, somehow peace will emerge. The notion is that somehow there's a misunderstanding. And I always say, look, we're in conflict not because we don't understand each other. We're in conflict because we understand each other perfectly. And we know that at this moment in our history, our goals are in conflict. It doesn't mean forever, but it takes time. It takes time to let go of the dream of having the other side disappear. I have a Palestinian colleague, a very brave man by the name of Professor Dajani. We signed together a declaration of mutual recognition of Israeli and Palestinian rights to the land. And I met him once for coffee after we've become friends. And he was very angry that morning, and he told me, I don't understand. What do you want? What do you want? And I told him, what do you mean? We want you to disappear. You want us to disappear. That's very easy. What we want is easy. Can we now discuss not what we want, but what can we get? What is possible? But it takes time historically to let go of what you want and to settle for much less. Now, in this context, UNRWA is an organization that is every day making sure that peace becomes harder to achieve rather than easier to achieve. I'm not saying that peace, if we take the word seriously, means that we can achieve it tomorrow. But I think we do have a responsibility, at least not to make it harder to achieve the day after tomorrow. This is one of the reasons that despite my understanding of the depth of the conflict, I continue to be someone who does not support settlements. I don't think it's one of our smartest policies, to say the least. I don't think that if we didn't have a single settlement, we would have peace tomorrow. But I think it is our responsibility to ensure that we keep the possibility open, without for a moment renouncing our story and our right. We need to be able to say, we have a historical connection to Judea. Look, I'm secular, I live in Tel Aviv, I would live nowhere else. But even I recognize that the Jewish people have a stronger connection to Judea than they do to Tel Aviv. But we need to be able to say politically, we have a right to Judea. We have a historical connection to it. But for the sake of peace, and because we understand that there is another people on this land with a right to be here, we will limit our exercise of this right, without for a moment forgoing that we have it. So this is on the settlement side. But what amazes me is that whereas the settlements are certainly not helpful, they are far from being the reason we don't have peace. And the global obsession with them is something that I fight against. Because it's so easy to refute that this is not the reason we don't have peace. 4 easy refutations. The first, there were no settlements between 1948 and 1967. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip were in Arab control, and yet the war continued. Israel was not recognized. The Jewish right was not recognized. After 1967, despite the fact that Israel controls the West Bank for 48 years, the settlements take only a small share of the land, 2 to 4%, most of it abutting the Green Line. It has not made a Palestinian state impossible. In fact, fact number 3, despite the settlements being there and growing in population, we had prime ministers such as Barak in 2000, Olmert in 2008, and probably Netanyahu in 2014, who have made territorial offers that were equal to the 1967 land. So the Palestinians could have had 100%. So the settlements did not prevent Israeli prime ministers from making excellent territorial offers that should have been enough. And yet, the word yes was nowhere to be found. And the last fact is quite simply, is that Israel has demonstrated, whether it's in Gaza, the Sinai, and some of the West Bank, that for the sake of peace, and even much less than that, it will uproot settlements effectively and ruthlessly. So I agree, it's stupid to build and then to take out. But Israel has demonstrated that it can and will do so. And if there is a possibility for peace with the entire Arab world, we will do so again, as painful as it might be. So this is a clear demonstration that this is not the reason we don't have peace. It might not be helpful, but it's not the core of the conflict. The core of the conflict remains the denial and rejection that the Jewish people have any right, any business being in this land. And UNRWA is the organization that carries this story. How does it do so? UNRWA, amazingly, is a United Nations organization established initially as a temporary organization to take care of those displaced by the Arab-Jewish War of 1948. It was going to be temporary. And then it became, over time, a permanent fixture, perpetuating the notion that every Arab who lived in the land, by now called an Arab-Palestinian, and their descendants in perpetuity are a refugee from Palestine. This is an organization that is funded to the tune of $1 billion a year by Denmark, by European countries, by the European Union, by, sadly, the United States, Australia, who are under the impression that it's a humanitarian organization. But UNRWA is in new windows, putting up new windows. They create the refugees, and then they say, we are needed to take care of them. They do something that is not done anywhere else. They perpetuate and create more and more generations. This is how we started from 700,000 displaced people, and today we have 5 billion people who are officially registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine. In addition, you have 2 to 3 million more people who, even though they might be citizens of Denmark, continue to argue that they are refugees from Palestine. And the Palestine they say they are refugees from is not the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestine they say they are refugees from is the West Bank, Gaza, and the State of Israel, so superseding the entire area. This is how you can have the amazing absurdity of 2 million of those who are registered as refugees who live in the West Bank and Gaza. The division is, of the 5 million, 2 million live in the West Bank and Gaza, 2 million are citizens of Jordan, but they're citizens with an asterisk. They're citizens but refugees from Palestine, and the remainder are in Lebanon and Syria, even though that's changing fast. So let's take your neighbor, Sweden, because that's incredibly instructive. Sweden has recently recognized Palestine, right? That's what the buses are asking Denmark to do. So before Denmark considers to follow in Sweden's footsteps, Sweden said, look, we are recognizing Palestine as an existing country. They didn't say one day we want to recognize Palestine. They said Palestine exists. There's territory, there's a people, there's a government. This is from the speech of the Swedish foreign minister. And she said, it meets the criteria of a state, so we recognize it as existing right now. And she also added, this will help promote peace. Sweden also happens to be one of the largest single country donors to UNRWA, and a very important country for UNRWA. Now, I argue that Sweden has to choose 2 of 3. It can't have all 3. It can't recognize Palestine, fund UNRWA, and say that this helps peace. Of course, it says all three, but I'm arguing it has to choose. Why does it have to choose, in my view? Because in Gaza have lived there all their lives. They've never been displaced an inch. They are the descendants. They've been born and living in Palestine that Sweden recognizes their entire lives. Yet they are registered as refugees from Palestine. This is the Palestine that, in their view, is the Palestine that should one day supersede Israel. So if Sweden supports both of these things, don't tell me you're supporting peace, because you're supporting the violent project of erasing Israel. If you want to support peace, please declare that together with your recognition of Palestine as a large single country donor to UNRWA, you are hereby declaring that those who live in Palestine are no longer refugees from Palestine. Simple, right? Logical. If Sweden were to do that, I would accept their notion that they're promoting peace. Because that would really send the message that there should be two states here for two peoples, that the Jewish people have a right to their state. I will say I'm even willing to theoretically go very far. I'm willing to say, let's acknowledge the right of return of both people, of the Jews to Hebron and Beit El, and of the Palestinians to Jaffa. And then let's agree that we both renounce the full exercise of this right in the interest of peace, because peace can only emerge when each one of us has our right to self-determination. And I always like it when people kind of say, why can't you just all live together, and you're kind of all the same. And the whole notion of self-determination is the self. And there are two peoples here with a distinct sense of self. And certainly these are two peoples who are more different than each other than many countries in the world. And yet no one tells those countries, why don't you just kind of give up who you are? So this is the amazing thing about UNRWA. UNRWA is funded by countries that have as their official policy the support of peace by means of two states. And yet they continue to fund the organization that makes sure that every day this becomes harder to achieve. Now, I've spoken to many European diplomats who fund UNRWA, Palestinians, it being the return. And I always think, what do you mean they don't take it seriously? It's the thing they take most seriously. It is the fundamental notion of what it means to be a Palestinian. Above and beyond everything else, being a Palestinian is being the person who wants to return to Palestine, even if you live in Ramallah. That's the essence of the identity. That's the core. They take it very seriously. They take it literally. They expect to return. Even though by now it's a fourth and fifth generation of people who have never lived there. They expect it very literally. How come you say they don't take it seriously? Are you even listening to them? And I find it amazing always because it's, as I said, it seems that the Israelis and Palestinians do take each other very seriously and understand each other very well. And yet so many around the world say, no, they don't take it seriously. It's negotiable. When I compare the issue of the settlements to the issue of the return, and I tell European diplomats, you know what? You want to be on our case for every balcony anyone builds in Gilo? Fine. But I want to see the same passion, the same commitment every day that a child born in Ramallah is registered as a refugee from Palestine. Why are you nowhere to be found on this issue? And they say things like, a house is a house. That's difficult. And, telling someone that they're a refugee, well, that's easily changed. I'm like, you really don't get this conflict. A house is easily moved. We did that. We're good at that. Telling someone that they're not returning, no one has dared saying that. No Palestinian leader has dared to say that. And when you raise people day after day to tell them, your home is not here. I love when everyone talks about the reconstruction of Gaza. Now imagine 80% of the population of Gaza is registered as refugees. Do you really want to make sure that we have no chance to ever achieve peace? Because that's what you're doing. And this is at least the battle. As much as I can't say that I've had any victories. Just recently, the United Nations celebrated 65 years of UNRWA. And you're thinking, this is the last thing you need to celebrate. How do you celebrate the perpetuation of a problem? If UNRWA behaved the way that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees treats all the other refugees in the world, it would have long ago declared success and gone home. Because most of the people are integrated into where they live. Gaza, Ramallah, Amman. To an extent they were in Syria, and certainly not in Lebanon, where they experienced real and official apartheid, and yet no one ever said a word about that. But that is not something to celebrate. It is merely a political organization that has been successfully masking itself as a humanitarian organization, funded by countries that want to do good, and yet seem to be so blind or willfully blind to the fact that they're making the possibility of peace, as difficult as it is, very difficult. Because the thing is this, everyone has something to say about our conflict. Everyone intervenes. Everyone wants to do a bus campaign. Everyone wants to mediate, negotiate, boycott. Everyone has something to say. Put a United Nations resolution in parentheses, something about the United Nations resolution that the French want to promote this coming fall in the General Assembly. It's beautiful. It shows you exactly how the world thinks about the conflict. Everything that matters to the Palestinians is very specific and has a deadline. 67 lines, ending the occupation by 2017, deadlines, clear borders. Everything that's important to Israel, the demand of return, security arrangements, will be negotiated. I'm like, look, if we can negotiate this, then we can negotiate everything. But if you're being very specific with deadlines on what you expect of Israel, how about being very specific with deadlines on what you expect from the Arab world and the Palestinians? Of course, normalization and to incitement, but be very clear that this means the end to any demand of return. I can assure you, by the way, that if the resolution would be this specific, the Palestinians would ask to take it back. And sometimes I have people, diplomats, who tell me, and what if the Palestinians don't take it back? I say, then we will have peace. So, because then we look at all the issues. And that's the thing. The world chooses one thing, the settlements, recognizing Palestine. That's easy. How about going to all the issues and treating all of them consistently, seriously? And the thing is this. I don't know that we can really tell the world to stop intervening. But if anything, I at least want to send the message that we are not children. We do not need to have our heads butted together. I always like it when yet another frustrated negotiator leaves our region. And they always have the same speech. The window of opportunity is closing. The train has left the station. They have these beautiful images. And I always think, do they know something I don't? Because we're kind of staying, and they're kind of staying. So by definition, the window is not closing. And we know their phone number, and they know our phone number. And at one point, we will figure it out. It takes time. It's a serious conflict. It has deep roots. We have both made choices that have consequences. And we will figure it out, and we will find each other to make real peace when we have finally both given up on what we want and be more willing to settle for what we can get. So thank you very much.
Very short question. You repeat a few times, it takes time, it takes time, it takes time. Behind us is more than 60 years. What is this extra time will change? What happened, what could happen this time will change when we see many generations going inside? The other question, I understand you working in UNRWA. No? You work
No, oh my God. They would never let someone like me work for them.
I don't understand how you can work in the...
No.
What is your
my name is Menashe.
Okay. Okay, so to the second question quickly, no, I don't work in UNRWA. I have no connection to them. The reason that I've started campaigning on this issue is when I was a member of parliament, I was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And I wondered why we're not raising this issue more powerfully. Because I noticed how the world views the conflict and the settlements and the occupation as being the key reasons. And my sense that the refusal to recognize the Jewish right to self-determination in the land, and part of it, is the core of the conflict. And UNRWA is the best kind of example that demonstrates this refusal. So it started from me asking, why are we not making more of it? I will tell you in parentheses, sadly, one of the reasons we're not making more of it is traditionally the Israeli defense establishment has taken the view that it's better to let UNRWA do its work of providing schooling and health care, and that's good, better than Hamas do it, better than Fatah do it. But this is a defense way of thinking. The defense establishment always thinks short term. Right now, UNRWA doesn't shoot at me, that's good enough. The defense establishment cannot think in terms of narratives. That's not defense thinking. So they don't say to themselves, yes, right now UNRWA is not a terrorist organization that shoots at me. But it is making sure every day that in the future terrorist organizations will have a lot of recruits who want to go back home, to free Palestine, to reclaim their home. And this is why a lot of my work is increasingly within Israel to convince that we need to change our policies within Israel towards UNRWA and realize that maybe they're helpful in the short term, but long term they're one of the most detrimental and dangerous organizations to the possibility of peace. Now, your first question was, as I said, I always forget, it was time. What time? What I expect time to do. Time will mostly contribute to our mutual exhaustion. That's basically it. And once you're exhausted, you're willing to consider things that you're not willing to consider when you have energy. So time will ultimately exhaust both sides of the possibility that the other can somehow one day disappear. But my concern with the work of UNRWA is that it keeps giving fuel and preventing this process of exhaustion. And that's my concern. Time will naturally, and this is what happens in all conflicts. When do conflicts get resolved? Not when the sides say, aha, I realize the logic, we need to have peace. You have peace when the sun...
Questions.
No, try to remember.
The first question is, who are the people working in UNRWA? Second question is, how was the discussion between UNRWA and Hamas after the Gaza war when Hamas put children inside the schools? And the third is more serious, that I thought about for a long time, that is, why doesn't anybody take UNRWA to the human rights organization in Hague, preventing Palestinian children from really learning, not hatred, but when you look into the school books, you can't, we are compared to pigs or apes or whatever, but the hatred and the teaching will never end somehow.
So, to your first question about who works in UNRWA, that's another amazing thing. UNRWA is essentially a Palestinian organization. It has a very small top of Western. The top person is always going to be a Westerner. Why? Because they need to fundraise in the West. So you don't want to send a Palestinian who speaks of our rights to Palestine to fundraise in Sweden or in the European Union. So you send a nice Swiss person or a nice Italian person, and they kind of say, look, it's humanitarian, it's about healthcare, it's about education, and the whole refugee issue, that's political. I love it. I've been in many debates with UNRWA, and they're always like, that's political, that's not our thing. I'm like, but you're political. You're making sure that the politics is tilted a certain way. It's a political Palestinian organization that employs about 30,000 Palestinians. So of course it tells the Palestinian story. By the way, it doesn't matter what you're going to write in the school books. I was chair of the education committee in Israel. I wrote a book on education. Politicians love to look at what's in the school books because it's very easy. The school books say something, you can change it, and then as a politician you can say, I changed this in the school books from A to B. And I always say, do you know the connection there is between what's in the school books and what's in the children's heads? Like there's zero connection. But so many people put the emphasis on the school books. The Palestinians, you will give them whatever school books you want. They will still tell the same story. You cannot prevent them from telling that story. That's their story. That's the essence of who they are. So, a lot of work is done on the school books, but in my view it's marginal. First of all, because it doesn't matter what will actually be taught. And my problem is not the school books. UNRWA love people who complain about the school books because then they correct something and they come back and say everything is fine. No, everything is not fine. The entire organization is wrong. So anything you do cannot be right, even if the school books are fine. The entire organization is wrong by the mere fact that you give the stamp of refugee to someone who's not a refugee. They should be thinking of themselves as a Palestinian Gazan, living, as they say in French, chez eux. They're living at home. They do not have another home that they need to free, reclaim, conquer. So this is why the employment of the organization is Palestinian. The history, the narrative is Palestinian. And it doesn't matter as a result what the school books will say, and they always have the explanations, and if you tell them to correct, they correct, and then they kind of... I've met with members of Congress who said, oh, you're...
I felt the frustration, basically, that we feel on a daily basis. Some things that open questions that I will appreciate if you can relate to. We get a lot of times this argument that you cannot compare between Israel and the Palestinians because of the huge strength of the two main institutions and the fact that we are a democracy advanced and they are not, so you cannot come with a similar set of demands to both sides, where you here basically said the Israelis and Palestinians on more or less on the same lines. I'll be happy to hear your argument for that. I promised a couple of questions, so sorry.
Sure, I'll try to remember.
Also, to get your take about your personal opinion about the time issue. Many believe that from Israel perspective, entirely Israel perspective, the time is not working for our benefit, demography and things like that. So appreciate your take on that. About the contributors to UNRWA, it will be interesting to hear for the more friendlier country towards Israel. You mentioned US, Australia and others. What are the feedbacks that you receive when they basically hear about the functioning of UNRWA? And the last thing, there was, of course, the famous speech of Abbas when he basically said that he sees himself going back to Safed only as a tourist. That was praised as some beginning of, do you see it as a really milestone or just a drop in the ocean?
Okay. So I'll try to go from the last to the first, and you'll help me if I forget. So the last on Abbas. A lot of people have made a lot from the fact that in one interview, Abbas said that he is okay with visiting Safed, his birth town, as a tourist. And many people thought, wow, the leader of the Palestinian people has renounced, from their perspective, the right of return. So first of all, he immediately made it clear in every possible media that he did no such thing. And he used a phrase that has become that is very popular, of course, among the Palestinians, but has since been transferred to Europeans, that this is a personal right. No one, no leader can negotiate it away. Again, this is something that exists nowhere, in no context. It's always a collective issue. But this has been now made to a personal right that every Palestinian descendant in perpetuity carries as their own. So he made it very clear that he was not renouncing, nowhere close to renouncing. In fact, he said, because it's a personal right, everyone has a choice. So my choice, I'm 80, I'll be there as a tourist. By the way, during the most recent war, his son and grandson were shown on video, which later they made sure to hide. His son, the son of Abu Mazen, was shown giving blood. And then he called his son over, and he said, my son, where are you from? And he said, Safed. Okay, he wasn't born in Sfat, as I'm sure you know. He was born in Ramallah. But the son, the little boy, said he's from Safed. And then the father turned to the camera and said, you see, Bibi, we have not given up. We will return. My son remembers. I remember. That is the ethos. That's how it works. So there was absolutely no such thing. But since I've seen so much willful desire to be blind on behalf of, mostly in Europe, so they were like, oh, this is great. This is great. We're done. You see Einat, they're not serious about it. They don't plan to return. So that's on that issue. The one before, the question was on... Oh, what do I say? Australia, United States, supposedly countries, Canada, that fund UNRWA and are not, they support Israel and they support peace. Here is where Israel comes into the picture, sadly. Canada stopped funding UNRWA at one point, and it only came back after Israeli pressure. Israel called it up and said, we need the funding. The notion is against the defense establishment, short-term thinking. The money helps now, it gives jobs. We don't need problems. So this is what you get. Do you know how many congresspeople I have who just say, Einat, the day your government will even give the beginning of a sign that they're lifting what I call the Iron Dome from UNRWA, we are so happy to go there. So sadly, it is the state of Israel that is giving this Iron Dome to UNRWA because it is the defense establishment that is making policy on this issue. Being a person of the foreign ministry, as I'm sure you know, on too many issues, it is the defense establishment that makes foreign policy rather than the foreign ministry. And the defense establishment thinks in certain terms that are, in my view, not the terms that we should be thinking in, or at least we should have a broader debate rather than this narrow thinking of like, okay, right now it gives them jobs and we don't want any trouble, so keep funding them. So Australia, Canada, United States, even the UK would be more than happy to change their policy, but it is actually the state of Israel that is pulling them back. The second question was time. Okay, once I read a great phrase which I love, that time, money, and technology are not bad, they're not good, but neither are they neutral. So time is on no one's side. Time is not a player. It matters what choices we make in that time. Demography is not destiny. Things have changed over the decades. So in my view, nothing is predetermined. Nothing is inevitable in a single direction. Time is on no one's side. It matters the choices that we make. It matters what happens in the region. Our choices are made within a specific regional context. Some regional contexts are more helpful, others are less. But I don't think time is an active player on either side. Just like football teams always say God is with us. Well, but he's also with the other team, apparently. They think so. So the notion that time is on the side of any one of the teams is one that I do not accept or see. Now, this really goes to the question of the Palestinians are weak, we are strong, so different standards. You're absolutely right that this is the narrative that is being pushed. It is being pushed to a degree that I just came from a tour of some American campuses, that Israelis who want to do things about peace and cooperation are saying that they can no longer do so. No Arab, no Palestinian will sit with them, because the anti-normalization mood has become very strong, but also this notion of we're not equal. We're not going to sit with you on the same stage, an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No, no, no. The narrative now is this is not a conflict. There is an evil occupier and there is a poor victim. And that's it. It's not a conflict. And much of the work that I try to do, and I think it's a very paternalistic, even colonial attitude to say that the Palestinians are these poor victims who cannot make their choices. They have made choices because they think the Jewish people have no business being in their land. That's their view. So yes, the occupation is humiliating to the Palestinians. But more humiliating to them is to accept the permanence of the Jewish state. So they have made a choice again and again and again to stay where they...
A very brief question. Since we are in a catch-22 situation, why not support the settlements and the expansion of the settlements, as it might lead to exhaustion? I'm not joking.
I know you're not joking. I'm actually going to treat it seriously.
I support them.
Yeah.
And the expansions as well.
Yeah. I'm aware of this argument. It's not devoid of some kind of logic to say, basically to say to the Palestinians, as long as you continue to say no, we will build more and more so that you recognize that there's no benefit to you repeatedly saying no. There is a certain logic to it, but in my view, we do have a responsibility for the same reason that I'm fighting UNRWA. I am not a supporter of the settlements because I think there is a mutual responsibility to not make it harder. And I think it ultimately does make it harder to disentangle the sides and to have two separate spheres of self-determination for the people. And that is my view and why I support it, not because I think there's peace tomorrow, but because I do think we have a responsibility to try to at least keep the option open. And even if this might have been a logic in the beginning, there is a danger that as it expands more and more, even that logic disappears. And then more people begin to say, let's just have one state, let's just have a binational state. And at the moment, at least, I don't see that leading to anything good. When many people say, you know what, not the two-state solution, the one-state solution. I always say, look, the one-state solution will merely change the name of the conflict from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the Jewish-Arab civil war. Take your pick, but it's not going to change the essence of what goes on in the territory. So that's basically all it is. I genuinely do believe that the Arab Palestinians have a right to self-determination in part of the land. We have a right to self-determination in part of the land. And as a responsible person who wants to put her money where her mouth is, I think we have a responsibility at least to keep that possibility open. That's all. Sure. Does exhaustion mean more wars? What does it mean to reach that moment of exhaustion? And the second had to do with the fact that some refugee camps are indeed poor and destitute. It's not all the middle-class families in Ramallah, and what about them? So first about exhaustion. I would love to live in a world where people realize a crisis, realize a situation before it happens, and make the logical choice that it would be a very nice world. But every politician will tell you that even if they know they need to do something, and it's the right thing to do, they can never do it until it gets really bad and there's a crisis, and then they can say, and now let's deal with the problem. Even though everyone can see the problems miles away. But there's something about the human inability to deal with issues before they become issues, before they become problems, before they become crises. It's a weird thing to say, but despite all the attention it gets, our conflict, and not just the Israeli-Palestinian, add to it the Arab-Israeli conflict, is one of the least violent conflicts in the world. Certainly over its history, certainly today. I read somewhere a league table of conflicts in our time. The Arab-Palestinian conflict, to be crude, in terms of body counts, was number 49. So supposedly, if you care about reducing body count in this world, and that's without talking about diseases and water sanitation and all that, just violent conflicts, there are 48 other places where, if you're a person of goodwill in the world, where you should care more. So I'm not wishing any more violence on either side. But I don't see how we can reach the moment where we can finally say to each other, we get it. You have a right to be here, you're staying, and we respect that. And for the other side to do it as well. I don't see that happening without further exhaustion. It doesn't necessarily mean wars. It might just be whatever happens on a daily basis, but I don't see it happening just as a result of the logical ability of people to know what's the right thing to do. That's not how humanity operates on anything, and every politician will tell you that. On the issue of the refugee camps, you're absolutely right. Many of the camps are slum neighborhoods, as are many other places around the world and in the Arab world. The question is ultimately one of responsibility and what do you do to change it. There was an excellent report published recently by the International Crisis Group. I don't know if you know it. It's a think tank organization. I can assure you not a Zionist one. They did a big piece called Bringing Back the Refugee Question. And they said very courageously, if we don't discuss this issue seriously, we will never make peace. And they added in a small phrase, and if we do discuss this issue seriously, there's a question of whether we can make peace. That's, of course, the problem. But what they described is that the ethos of the refugee, of the return, is so powerful that even when there are projects or initiatives to improve living conditions, to even paint houses, there's a rejection, because anything that sends the message of permanence, that this is my home, is one that's immediately rejected. There's no concept even of, let's live a good life in the meantime until we return. No, it's don't touch anything because this is not permanent. This is temporary. Doesn't matter if it's been 50 years. So, it's ironic when people say about the Israeli occupation, after 48 years you can't call it temporary. But no one ever tells the Palestinians, after 48 years, stop saying that you're here temporarily and start coming to terms with the fact that you're here permanently. So this temporariness is going all around. So let me tell you something. I went recently to Bangkok to a conference on the Middle East. People from China, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia even. And there were panels on Iraq, on Iran, and one on Israel-Palestine where I spoke, and 2 more panelists. It was the least attended session. And suddenly I was in a place where the whole conflict in the region was discussed as a conflict in a region where there are many. It was so rational. There was no emotion. None of what I see when I go, of course, to Europe or even the United States. None of that. It was so refreshing. Suddenly our conflict was at the right size in the region. There are bigger fish to fry. So there are places, and we need to acknowledge that. Look, I'm an atheist. I like to call myself a devout atheist. But even an atheist like myself has to accept that theology plays a role. And we need to acknowledge that whether it is in the Christian world, and it's the areas of the Christian world, and in the Islamic world, theology plays a role. Someone who was in Norway told me that Norway once used to be the biggest exporter of missionaries to the world. And even though today it's a very secular country, it still has a sense of being a missionary to the world and thinking that it knows what's right. So theology doesn't change when God disappears. And we still need to acknowledge that for good or for bad, in the Islamic world and in the Christian world, even when it's secular, there will still is an obsession with everything Jews do, have done, will do. And at least this is one reason I'm tremendously optimistic with the rise of China and India. This is one of the biggest, best news we have. So on the rise of the East, let me end it on this note, and thank you for tonight.